In part 1, you saw Krishna's genius. In part 2, you'll see what it costed him.
He acts really as a strategist who has to make difficult decisions and has to encourage the Pandavas to agree to these difficult decisions. These ideas of Krishna are often called strategies. The Kauravas call it the crooked strategies, because in many cases they explicitly break rules before. The ultimate death of Drona was not part of Krishna's advice, and the ultimate death of Bhurishravas was not part of Krishna's advice. That was taken to another level.
Did he have a role to play in saving the Pandavas?
Once again, Krishna protects them, but still Ashwatthama is able to kill the 5 children of the Pandavas. The victory comes at a cost for them. Gandhari tells him about, in the same way, your family will kill each other, and you will die in a noble death. His role in the Mahabharata as primarily a strategist is actually one of the most fascinating, because leads them to victory and also see the consequences of that.
Welcome to Mythic Dialogues. This is part 2 of a wonderful conversation on Krishna's genius with Dr. Vishal Sharma. If you have not watched part 1 yet, you'll find the link in the description of the video. I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation with Dr. Vishal. So guys, you too, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Vishal, before we get into discussing Krishna's role in the war, there's this one meeting that he has with one of the key warriors on the Kaurav side, Karna. So he ends up meeting Karna, and it's a fabulous conversation. So can you tell us a little bit about that conversation and why Karna, in spite of Krishna coming directly to him, sort of doesn't agree to what Krishna is asking of him?
Yeah, in some ways, I think that is, for Krishna, the more important meeting than the Soviets' mission at the Kaurava court, because one is more realistic and one is idealistic. If he understands, and as it appears to be, that he understands that war is going to happen, the peace mission may not pan out, but it would be beneficial to have someone like Karna on their side, to neutralize Arjuna, especially to neutralize Arjuna against Karna. So in many ways, he saves this revelation for this moment where it really matters. And it's important that he doesn't meet Karna in front of any. It's the two of them meeting privately, and he tells him about his lineage. He tells Karna that, look, you're the son of Kunti, and you are therefore older than Yudhishthira. So he lays it out for him. He says, practically speaking, if you join this side and you're a part of the victorious side, you're older than Yudhishthira. You can enjoy the kingdom as this elder brother. In some ways, he could probably enjoy the kingdom as king because he is older than Yudhishthira.
Did he discuss that with? Did he discuss that with Yudhishthira or Kunti before offering the kingdom to Karna?
No.
But knowing Yudhishthira, knowing Yudhishthira, he would not be very opposed to it.
Yeah. I think Draupadi might have had some views on that if he discussed it with him. But again, him being the strategist, he knows who to speak to and what to say to them. Yeah. So he lays out the stakes for Karna. He gives him this big, this thing that we as the audience, as the reader, knows, that he is the son of Kunti, but it's not entirely clear that Karna knows about that up until that point. Now we have the confirmation that yes, he's being told of who his birth mother is and what the implications for that are. So Krishna makes a very compelling case that because of your birth, who your birth mother is, you could be on this side. And instead of fighting Arjuna, instead of fighting the Pandavas, you would be a compelling figure on the Pandava side. And Karna, in his immediate reaction, um, doesn't seem to deny that, okay, well, Kunti may be his birth mother, but he shows his loyalty in more than one way. He shows his loyalty to his family that adopted him, or this family that took him in. He says they're the ones that raised me. They're the ones that, in essence, made him who he is. And for much of the story up until that point, Karna is often derided as a son of a charioteer. So this was very much part of his identity, the same identity that he was sometimes attacked for, and now the same identity that Krishna wants to sort of kind of break and have him see a bigger picture. And he is leaning into that identity because that identity makes up so much of who he is. And he also notes that he leans in on his friendship with Duryodhana. He says, his loyalty is to Duryodhana. So it wouldn't be fair to abandon him now with this information when Duryodhana took him in and really gave him the position he has that wouldn't have been given.
And is counting on him, is counting on Karna, as possibly the only antidote to Arjun.
Yeah. And, there, in some ways, Krishna is looking out for the victory of the Pandavas, and he's looking out for, on one level, the interest of his friend, the interest of Arjuna. And Karna's saying, I also have to look out to the interest of my friend. And there's enough in the story of the backstory with Duryodhana and Karna to see that Karna does feel in debt to him for taking him in, not because he was seen as a charioteer's son, but in spite of that. So he has this loyalty to him. At the same time, Karna is one of the few on the Kaurava side who expresses some regret for the way things have unfolded. He says he owns up to his role. He seems to be alluding to what happened during the dicing match. He owns up to his role in his use of words to kind of encourage the conflict. Some of the things he said to the Pandavas, some of the things he probably, including maybe some of the things he said to Draupadi. It's a moment of clarity for Karna because he's realizing that Krishna's coming to me with this request because he realizes, that means war is definitely happening. But B, to go back to the earlier part of our discussion, it didn't have to be this way. Maybe he's taking a little bit of ownership that maybe if I had conducted myself better in certain situations, these fires didn't have to be stoked. It could have played out differently. And then we're told that, Krishna hears this and he smiles. And he asks him, doesn't this offer, doesn't this interest you even in the slightest? Like, he is giving him a path to not just, kingship of his own kingdom, but a much larger base of power. They would be unstoppable. And Karna says, no, Karna is at that point as realistic about the situation as he can be. He's realistic about, to some extent, of what he's done to get there, his own role in that, and he owns up to that a little bit. He's realistic to his own alliance with Duryodhana and that he's not going to break that for some extra personal gain. And he very respectfully declines Krishna's offer. And that sort of sets in motion a series of events that will eventually lead to Karna's defeat and Ghatotkacha, his battle with Ghatotkacha. But we can tell that even from the beginning of the war, or just before the war, Krishna is thinking about how to neutralize Karna. Absolutely.
So, and that actually brings me to the next part of our discussion. There are these famous and great warriors that sort of are slain. The Kuru warriors like Bhishma, Drona, Karna, and even Duryodhana. And Krishna seems to play a part in each one of these deaths, not as a warrior. And yes, many would struggle to even call it strategy. So what is your point of view about on these deaths, on the Bhishma Vad, sort of taking help of Shikhandi and asking, So if you can, I mean, from I think let's begin with Bhishma, considering he was the first commander of the Kaurav army, and for 10 days I think he created absolute havoc.
Yeah, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of the Mahabharata. I mean, in some sense, it would be less interesting for him to use some kind of supernatural power and just move the chessboard to benefit the Pandavas through some kind of divine intervention. But he acts really as a strategist who has to make difficult decisions and has to encourage them being the Pandavas, to agree to these difficult decisions. And that creates actually the most drama in the war, that makes it really interesting. Otherwise, Vyasa is emphasizing, throughout the war, just the rote violence of it. He's just writing, this person killed this person killed this person. But interspersed with that is the drama behind the violence. That's what's really pulling the war in these directions. They're often called, these ideas or these ideas of Krishna are often called strategies, upayas. And the Kauravas call it the jihma upayas, the crooked strategies. And they're called that, by that side, because in many cases they explicitly break rules of the advice, or they're seen as things that are not done, even if they don't fully break a rule of war. But as we'll understand when we go through these episodes, there's more complexity to it. In some cases, things end up devolving beyond what Krishna has actually advised, and culminates at the end with Duryodhana taking him to task. But a lot of it is Krishna advises one thing and it's followed through to some extent, and then it just gets worse. The defeat of Bhishma, he's still alive, but in order to remove him as the commander for the army, to really put him in a position where he can't be commander of the army, Bhishma more or less lays this out for them, that this is the path forward if you want to defeat me. I won't fight Shikhandi. I won't stand in front of someone he viewed as a woman in battle. And so Krishna has Arjuna stand behind Shikhandi, so that Bhishma won't retaliate. Bhishma will take the arrows, but he won't retaliate, because retaliating would mean hitting Shikhandi, who he views as a woman. So that really sets up a chain of events that lead into these other examples of the Pandavas, breaking the rules of war, using strategies that involve breaking the rules of war to get to victory. But I would also say that most of the key episodes of Krishna's strategies actually come after the death of Abhimanyu, which in of itself broke rules of war, because you're not supposed to have multiple people attack one person. Like, that is also breaking the rule of war. So it seems as if that becomes a point of no return for these kinds of things.
Absolutely beautiful. I mean, I never associated, Krishna's later counsel with Abhimanyu being slain. But yeah, now that you say it, it makes absolute sense. Take us through the killing of Drona, and what part did Krishna play in it? And did he justify? How did he justify? Because this was an outright, yes, people call it a half lie, but we all know that, it did the job. It did the job of a complete lie.
Yeah. As you say, the intent was to deceive. Right before, actually, so after we have the death of Abhimanyu, and then Arjuna vows to avenge his death by killing Jayadratha, we have this moment where before the death of Drona, where Krishna engineers something else, where Purishravas is fighting with a family member of Krishna, Satyaki. And Krishna sees this, and he says, he sees the way the battle is going, and he's with Arjuna, and he sees that this is not going in Satyaki's favor. Like, this is not going to end well. And so he says to Arjuna, he says, you need to intervene. You need to help this person on your side who's about to be defeated.
Yeah.
And initially Arjuna is silent. He doesn't
want-
react to it. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to because he knows that that's not the way battle should be conducted, right? So he's viewing it from, this isn't how I view myself as a kshatriya. This is I'm following the rules of war. I want to kill people. If I'm defeating someone, I'm defeating them fairly. Da 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 da. And then he says it again. He says, "Look, it's either that or Satyaki dies." And of course, Satyaki is, Krishna's family member. He is a Yadava. And so Arjuna intervenes, right? He breaks that rule of war. There's two people fighting, and he intervenes. He hits the arm of Bhurishavas. He strikes Bhurishavas with an arrow and incapacitates him. At a moment where we're getting the impression that up until that point, Bhurishavas has the lead. It's just the final, he just needs to make the final strike and it's over. And at that moment is when Arjuna intervenes. So Bhurishavas is extremely frustrated because the battle was going really very well for him up until that point. And he sees that Arjuna has done it, but he doesn't fix his anger at Arjuna. He turns to Krishna. And he says, Kohi nama pramattaya. What is the name of a person who would do such a thing, who isn't a friend of Krishna? So who else but a friend of Krishna would do such a thing, right? So he's already hinting at this idea that Krishna is the engineer to the strategy, and that he's recognizing Krishna as the engineer. And of course, Krishna doesn't tell Satyaki, the idea is once you leave war, and this is important for the Drona episode, which we're going to come to, once you leave war, agree to leave the battle, you are no longer a combatant. If you are no longer a combatant, you are not in the game as it is. You are not in war. You are not to be killed because you're not a combatant. You're a civilian, as it were. And so Bhurishava sees the writing on the wall, and he, they say he's going to this meditation. He's done. And in that moment, Satyaki intervenes and cuts him off. And that is actually that wasn't part of Krishna's advice. But it's taken a step further.
Yeah.
So you have there like two instances where the rules of battle are broken or someone has been killed dishonorably. But really, it's only one part of that where Krishna is really responsible for that, or that was part of his initial advice. And then
yeah, please. No, continue.
No, and then we get to the Drona episode where you see a slight. I mean, it's very fascinating to see not just the advice Krishna gives, but how each Pandava reacts to that advice. So, in his initial with Bhurishavas, where he tells Arjuna, "Look, you need to intervene." Arjuna is initially silent, but he listens. In the case of Drona, he realizes that there is no path to victory without Drona out of the way. He is the teacher of the Pandavas. He's taught them what they know. Can they realistically or seriously defeat him in fair battle? And so he says this time, all the Pandavas are there when he says this. This isn't just him and Arjuna. He says someone has to cast aside dharmam utsrujya, and tell Drona that his son has died. And in believing that his son has died, he will cast aside his weapons and leave battle in a state of grief. And this is important because like Bhurishavas, the goal is just to neutralize them so that they're out of battle. If they're out of battle, then they're no longer a factor. So that is really the thrust of his initial advice. That
very interesting.
All we need to do is convince him that his son has died and he will leave battle, and he doesn't have to die. It's not about killing him, actually.
Yeah.
Now, this is not as clear-cut as the Bhurishavas, where he's instructing them to break a clear rule of war. What he's asking them to do when he says dharmam utsrija, to cast aside dharma, is that someone needs to mislead, to lie, to convince Drona that his son is dead. And actually he doesn't direct it first to Yudhishthira alone. He just says it. And Arjuna rules it out. He says, I'm not doing it. In this case, we have
Beam takes it up.
Beam takes it up. I realize this. He has no issues with it. But Arjuna, because of his relationship maybe with this, this is, he was the star pupil, all these things. This is one of the rare moments where Arjuna says, no, I'm not doing it. So then Bhima has no reservations about it. Bhima is very much on the same page. And so Bhima doesn't go directly and tell Drona that Ashwatthama is killed. He goes and he kills an elephant by the name of Ashwatthama. And he says, Ashwatthama has been slain. And Drona at that moment knows that this is a possibility, but he won't believe it from really anyone other than Yudhishthira. The Dharma, he is the, all these Pandavas are amshas or portions of different gods. He's an amsha of Dharma itself. So, he hasn't told a lie. He trusts him. Drona trusts him. And so, when Krishna gives us advice, it seems to me that he is directing it to Yudhishthira, but I think in the beginning he is opening it up to either Arjuna or Yudhishthira, because he knows that also Arjuna, Arjuna is his star pupil. Like there's a level of trust between Arjuna and Drona that could be used here. But now it falls. But Arjuna's ruled it out. Drona's, he's self-aware enough to know Bhima's, he's not going to trust Bhima alone. So he wants to hear from Yudhishthira. And like you say, Yudhishthira, I mean, all Krishna says is that, we have to just convince him that his son has died. But the way Bhima has set it up, he's created a scenario where Yudhishthira can sort of muddle the, going between a full lie and maybe a half lie or truth. And he says, in response to Drona's question, is Ashwatthama dead? He says, Ashwatthama, and then quietly, the elephant has been killed.
Yeah.
Now, at that point, what does that accomplish? The intent was still to deceive, as you say, right? So he is still, and the effect is the same. It's still seen as a lie because we're told his chariot, which was always a few leagues off above the earth, has now fallen to the ground, despite this. So
there is this. It's very interesting that you talk about Satyaki. And if you can, I know it's a little out of the turn, but if I was to ask you the question as to if Krishna was the only Yadav who was supposed to fight from the Pandav side, and his army was sort of supposed to fight for the Kauravas, what was Satyaki, a Yadav, doing in the Pandav camp?
We have really two key people from the Yadava side fighting on different sides. We have Kritavarma, who, when at this time which we spoke about, when Duryodhana goes to try to get the support of Krishna, Balarama says, I'm going to be neutral. Krishna's brother says he's going to be neutral, and Kritavarma, another Yadava, aligns himself with the Kauravas.
Oh. Yeah.
And of course, Satyaki aligns himself with the Pandava side. And it makes for an interesting dynamic because you don't really have the Yadavas on one specific side neatly. You have Krishna as a charioteer, you have Satyaki fighting for the Pandavas, and of course Kritavarma fighting for the Kauravas. Then there's the army of warriors that Krishna has led to Duryodhana's side. So you have this sort of the spread of Krishna and his family and people connected to him, actually throughout both sides. And then you have Krishna as the charioteer.
It's very interesting that you talk about. Satyaki being family. There's a very interesting role that Satyaki's family plays in Krishna's birth. It is actually. When Devaki Swayamvar was happening, Satyaki's grandfather fought. So there was supposed to be a duel. There were other people who were interested in Devaki, and on one side was Bhurishavas, father of Bhurishavas, and on the other side was the grandfather of Satyaki, Shini. who ended up fighting. And grandfather of Satyaki, Shini, he actually fought for Vasudev and won. So that, and I think there must be some gratitude that Krishna would want to show to that family and not have Satyaki being killed in front of his eyes. Very interesting. So the question that I had was, and in fact, an observation, which is something that I've never sort of thought about before. But the fact that Krishna actually didn't want Bhurishavas or Drona to be killed. Bhurishavas was killed because Satyaki just gets up and then chops his head off after Bhurishavas has put down his arms and is sitting down in meditation. And the Drona episode is almost a mirror image of that exact episode, where Krishna possibly thought that, telling him that his son has died will get him out of the war. But Drishtitum sort of just gets up and then kills Dronacharya. So do you think Krishna sort of didn't anticipate these two actions and these two killings?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in some ways, these two mirror each other, because just as Satyaki and Bhurishavas had this this history before they were fighting, that really extends beyond what's happening on the battlefield between just two random warriors. Drishtadyumna and Drona have a history that goes back to Drona's relationship with Drishtadyumna's father. And so it is also personal for Drishtadyumna, as it is for Satyaki. It is so Drona believes Yudhishthira, and he's grieving for his son, and he says he's leaving battle. And so up until that point, that's where Krishna's advice really ends. That is his strategy. That was his, they got what they needed. He's now out of the war because he is left. He's left formally by doing the same kind of meditation. And then Drishtadyumna comes and slays him while he is meditating. So you have this is a clear breaking of the war, because you're not supposed to hit someone who isn't a combatant. And of course, this happens with wars, that it's not all the time where non-combatants can be saved, but it is a very important rule of war today and back then, that we should respect the rules of combat, and non-combatants should not be killed. That wasn't part of his advice. That was taken to another level. So I think in some ways his immediate goal was not to necessarily kill them, but to devise a strategy whereby they leave battle. So they don't necessarily have to die through any dishonorable means, but they can just be out of the war. And that's his immediate goal, to basically neutralize these people. In the first case, it's to neutralize and protect Satyaki. But in Drona's case, the stakes are much higher, because Drona is the commander of the army. And in the immediate aftermath of that, even Arjuna is, he's angry at Drishtadyumna. He says he's not going to lie to his teacher, and he doesn't give Yudhishthira anything he doesn't say anything to Yudhishthira about the lie, but it is the way in which Drona dies that he thinks is unfair and not befitting of someone of Drona's stature, that to have him die in such an dishonorable way. Because of course, even in interactions between Kshatriyas, there are honorable ways to die and dishonorable ways to die. But the ultimate death of Drona was not part of his initial advice, Krishna's advice, and the ultimate death of Bhurishavas was not part of Krishna's advice.
Wonderful. There's a fabulous explanation, and that brings me to the most controversial of the three, which is, and I think the most direct role that Krishna plays in a particular death is that of Karna. I think it's very clearly established that Karna, while fighting, had his had the wheel of his chariot sort of go down into mud, and he could not move, and he had put down his arms, and he was trying to take that wheel out, and Krishna sort of implores upon Arjun to shoot him dead. So, can you take us through that, and what was Krishna's philosophy? And how did Krishna justify that?
That is one of the cases where, before it happens, you have someone on the other side trying to convince him not to go there, because Karna understands that if he does this, this is a possibility.
Hmm.
But you see, up until that point, you see Krishna is still preoccupied with this idea of, if I can put it this way, neutralizing Karna. Because Karna has, or he had, an arrow that could, this one arrow that could hit a target without fail. And he knows that this is a problem for Arjuna, that if he goes into battle with Arjuna, this could end that battle. So he knows that even before the battle between two of them are going to happen, he needs to set the game on a level playing field so that this arrow is no longer in Karna's possession, because he understands that Karna will be saving that arrow for an important adversary, and therefore very likely had to use it, right, on Arjuna. And so he has, even before that battle, he has Ghatotkacha. He has him, the son of Bhima, who is also, a Rakshasa of sorts, because his mother is Hidimba. He has him take advantage of his nature as a Rakshasa and make it difficult for the Kauravas to attack him. And, Ghatotkacha becomes this very, very worthy opponent, because he's frustrating. Just his mere presence. The Kauravas are not able to get the best of him. And in a moment of frustration, Karna uses that spear, uses that arrow that really, it seems that it was meant for Arjuna. That arrow that he knows will not miss. He uses it for Ghatotkacha.
Yeah, just to add to what you're saying, I think if Karn was at this point in time only a warrior, maybe he still would not have used the Shakti on Ghatotkacha. But Karn at this point in time was the commander of the army. Ghatotkacha, I think, because he was slaying the Kaurav army left, right, and center, you had the entire Kaurav army sort of begging Karn to slay this Rakshas. So I've always wondered if Karn was just a warrior at that point in time, just a Maharathi, Ati Maharathi, and not the commander of the army, would he have still used that one arrow? Yeah. So please.
Yeah, that's an important point. I mean, it's, he feels the burden of being he's the general at that point. So things like this, in some ways, fall to his responsibility. And so it even puts even more pressure on him to use it. And maybe that may be why, maybe there was a method to the timing of when Krishna decides to send out Ghatotkacha. He waits till Karna is commander of the army at that point, so that he would feel the pressure to use that thing, or feel the pressure to at least defeat him. And so he does it. And, it's a moment, it's a moment of, it's a moment of sadness for the Pandavas. They've obviously lost one of their sons in Abhimanyu, and now Ghatotkacha, who was so, who's a son of Bhima, who was so loyal and helpful to them when they were in exile. He is now dead. And so there's this scene where
they've already lost Iravan and now Ghatotkacha.
Yeah.
So Abhimanyu and Iravan and Ghatotkacha, three of the prominent warrior sons that the Pandavas had, all killed. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, they're feeling that the weight of this war now, and it's their kids. Theory wants to outlive their children, right? And so Bhima's sitting there and mourning Ghatotkacha, and we're told there's this moment where they're sitting there, Ghatotkacha lies slain, Bhima's sitting there, the Pandavas are sitting there in mourning, and Krishna sees that Ghatotkacha has been slain, and he starts to jump for joy. He starts to dance, and Bhima is a little taken aback. He doesn't know what to make of that. And Arjuna, being Arjuna, again, they have this relationship. Arjuna, goes up to him and says, well, what are you doing? What is the meaning of this? What is there to celebrate right now? And Krishna says, now Karna cannot defeat you with this arrow. It is now, in theory, a fair battle. This is not Karna's victory is not guaranteed. And there's a path to victory now. There's a path now for you and Karna to have a one-on-one battle, and you can defeat him. And so we're made to understand from that Krishna strategically deploys Ghatotkacha in hopes that in a moment of frustration, Karna will use that one arrow that he needed him to use. So even leading up to that final battle, Krishna is thinking about how to neutralize Karna as a bigger problem. First he tries to entice him to come to their side. He respectfully declines. And now he realizes, okay, I need to neutralize this. So he gets him to use that arrow against someone else. So the stage is sort of set now for a battle with Karna. And we're told that it's, as can be expected, they're going one for one. Karna and Arjuna, they're hitting one for one. Even Krishna at some point gets caught in the crossfire of it from Karna's arrows, and he's telling him, "Look, you need to end this. You need to do this. You need to finish this." And I should also say that there's two different dynamics between there's really 4 people in this battle, but 2 are combatants, 2 are charioteers. There's a dynamic with Karna and his charioteer, Shalya, and the dynamic with Krishna and Arjuna. We know that Krishna has Arjuna's best interests, and Krishna is giving him advice in a way that would encourage him. But we know that Shalya is there to demoralize Karna, to bring down his. Yeah, it's like in sports games when one team is playing at another team's home state or home country. That team that they're often getting booed and things like that, and it can be very demoralizing because you're just hearing people booing you. And so Karna already has this kind of negative thing going for him, and that he's not getting help from his charioteer. His charioteer is putting him down in many ways. Whereas Arjuna has the support and advice of Krishna. Krishna is really lifting him up in many ways. And so, like you say, he in this moment that has been predicted, his wheel gets stuck in the earth, and he just wants, he wants to essentially pause the battle for a second so he can take this wheel out. And so he tells them, he says, "Look, I am going to get down. I'm going to remove this wheel, and then we can continue battle. I'm not leaving battle. But at the same time, I have to turn around to do this." He says, he appeals to Arjuna here. He says, he's not talking, at this point, he's not talking to Krishna. He says to Arjuna, be a good Kshatriya, follow your Kshatriya dharma. Don't hit someone when they're not facing you, which is another one of these norms of Kshatriya dharma that, you don't hit someone when they're not looking at you. And he probably does that because he knows it may appeal to Arjuna. And what Arjuna, he considers himself this good Kshatriya who's not going to do that. And so Krishna challenges Karna. And he says, where was your dharma? Where was your concern for dharma when you were in the, during the dicing match, when you encouraged this kind of abuse of Draupadi? Where was it then? So he's pointing out, I think in that moment, he's trying to point out the hypocrisy in one side that is trying to appeal to some kind of pure following of the rules. And he's saying, well, no side here has completely obeyed the rules, but also you have broken this dharma that you're trying to now conveniently hold up at this moment. So who are you to lecture anyone on following the dharma and following the proper rules and procedure? And of course, Arjuna takes the shot. Arjuna kills him when he's not facing him. So even with the funny thing is, even with the arrow gone, that one arrow being out of the way, Arjuna still resorts to some level of trickery or cheating to finish the battle. But in the process, Karna doesn't get the last word. It's Krishna who gets the last word. You get the impression that throughout these episodes we've been looking at, it's not really just Arjuna and Karna, it's Krishna and Karna who have different kinds of interactions. And it reaches this moment where Krishna is reminding him that you're not you're not perfect either in how you follow dharma in some of the things you've done. So I don't think you should be lecturing anybody. Which was an interesting moment. But it secures it. Karna is killed, and it secures victory for them.
I mean, hearing all this, I wonder. I mean, you had already mentioned that Krishna goes to Karna and tells him about his lineage, his birth. Do you think? I mean, why do you think Krishna doesn't sort of disclose it to Arjun? Because I don't think. Do you think Arjun would have still killed Karna the way he killed him if he had known that Karna was his elder brother?
Yeah, I mean, Yudhishthira, I don't know. I mean, Yudhishthira finds out after, and Yudhishthira is actually quite angry about it, that he didn't know this. So
I'm sure none of the brothers knew about it.
No. And so, this kind of goes back to Krishna as the strategist. It's not only about his advice, but what he chooses to disclose to some versus what he chooses to disclose to others. He has this end goal in mind, and if that is not beneficial to the end goal, which is defeating Karna, he's not going to do something that is going to threaten that.
Yeah.
And so I suspect it doesn't play out this. I mean, and I think Karna, actually requests that the Pandavas don't know about this, because I think he suspects that it would change the dynamic. So in some ways, Karna is open to the possibility even before that battle that it's going to end with either me dead or Arjuna dead. And he doesn't want to demoralize or put that conflict in Arjuna's head or Yudhishthira's head. That's a burden he carries to his death, but he doesn't want his brothers in some way carry that burden with them to his death, to have to know that they're killing their half-brother or their brother.
That's true. Even in his death, he doesn't sort of tell Arjun that, you're killing your elder brother. Yeah. Fantastic.
I mean, that would have been a good moment to do it, right? I mean, he's desperate for something to appeal to Arjuna and say, "Don't hit me when I'm turning around." He could have used that line then to try to, yeah.
Absolutely. No, and this is, I think, what makes for a brilliant epic. So many what ifs. I think we must have discussed some 10 what ifs. I mean, right here in our conversation, and you always wonder if things had happened slightly differently. What would the? In fact, when you were talking about Shalya being the demotivating charioteer to Karna, I think it also answered one of my earlier questions, that what would have happened if Krishna had decided to become a charioteer to, or Duryodhana had taken him on as a charioteer. I think it is pretty nicely disclosed that even if you have a charioteer who's extremely good at his work, purely by his words he can demotivate you. And I assume that Krishna would have done the demotivation a lot better than even what Shalya could do to Karna.
Oh yeah, that would have been an interesting thought experiment to see how. But I think you're right that he would have done what Shalya did, and trying to demoralize Duryodhana to try to discourage it. He would, yeah.
Absolutely. So one, I mean, I think we are coming to some of the last questions. There are two more questions that I have. One is regarding Krishna's role in saving, if he really saving the Pandavas during the Saupik Parva. Did he have a role to play in saving the Pandavas on the night that Ashwatthama sort of decided to burn and kill the entire Pandav camp?
Yeah, I mean, he is in many ways. On one hand, that's like that episode is like a terrible, tragic misunderstanding gone wrong. But he makes sure that the Pandavas are not there that night when Ashwatthama is gone to do this horrible thing, right? So at this point, rules of war are just completely out of, everyone has thrown everything out. Everyone's desperate. So Ashwatthama says, he decides he's just going to kill them in their sleep, right? That's obviously not an honorable way to kill someone. And he is angry about what has happened at the Mace battle.
His father.
And of course, what has happened to Yudhishthira, and that's also an important episode, because that's where they have this larger debate, Krishna and Duryodhana, as to the ethics of what has happened, which then motivates Ashwatthama to go do what he's done. But once again, Krishna protects them, but it comes at a cost, because there has to be 5, he has to think, he mistakes these 5 Pandavas, these 5 sons of Draupadi and the Pandavas, for the 5 Pandavas themselves. And it comes at a cost. He's killed these children, he's killed these descendants of the Pandavas. And so you have a situation at the end of the war where the Pandavas win, but a number of their own descendants do not survive. And if we think about kingship as something of descendants, to carry on that line, we see that a lot of that has been actually erased. So that the victory comes at a cost for them. And Krishna protects the Pandavas, but still Ashwatthama is able to kill the 5 children of the Pandavas as a result.
Very interesting. Could he have saved the entire Pandav camp? Could he have saved a few more? If he could save the Pandavas, why not the Pandavas? So,
I mean, it goes into this what if moment where, what would Ashwatthama have done if he didn't see 5 people there? He may have continued searching. He may have, so it may have been a difficult decision that had to be made. But, we do see a time with these strategies of Krishna that oftentimes protecting someone comes with a cost, but also the thing that he envisions them doing is then taken to another level. So if I could bring up the Mace battle, for example, the Mace battle is this climactic this happens before Ashwatthama kills the 5 sons, but it's this climactic battle between Bhima and Duryodhana, right? And these are, like you say, a lot of these battles that have some kind of questionable element are between 2 people who have a lot of history. And these 2 cousins have history with each other, right? We get the sense that they were not exactly kind to each other growing up, and they were mistreated by one another. So there's something building between these 2 that, is now coming out in the battlefield. To say nothing of, and of course, what happens to Draupadi and Bhima's vow to avenge her. And so once again, they're battling, and these are 2 ace warriors in this field of this field of Mace battle. One of the key rules is you don't hit below the belt. You don't hit someone below the waist. And Krishna, once again, like he sees with Arjuna and Karna, he sees that the only end to this stalemate, the battle's going on to a stalemate, but his brother Balarama, who's taught the Mace battle, is sort of the referee. And he tells the Pandava, he says, look, he's gonna have to hit his thighs. And of course, that is famously a weak spot of Duryodhana, that if he hits that would actually affect him negatively. He's going to have to hit. And he says, he anticipates the potential fallback, the potential criticism to that. And he says, there have been times when Devas and Asuras have fought, and the Asuras had the upper hand, and the Devas had to use certain strategies to win, to get to victory. And this is the situation. The stakes couldn't be higher, because with the defeat of Duryodhana, regardless of what Ashwatthama did, the war is over. So this is it if they can defeat Duryodhana. And so he signaled, they signal to Bhima that to hit his thighs. And that was the plan. And so he does, and he falls to the ground. He's defeated. But then Bhima takes it a step again. Bhima takes it a step further and goes and crushes his head or stomps on his head. This is not that wasn't part of Krishna's advice.
Krishna's counsel.
So, yeah. So immediately Balarama and all, he's livid that his 2 students are fighting, and one of them broke the rules of war and then broke what he saw as the kind of decorum of how you treat an opponent. And of course, Bhima had vowed to avenge him by hitting his thighs when he showed his thighs to Draupadi in the dicing match. So, some of this is already building up and was inevitable. And Balarama and Krishna share words in this moment. It's not just the Kauravas arguing with Krishna. These 2 brothers are one side is defending the other. And, And Balarama says, look, you're being partial to the Pandavas right now. I'm a referee. And outwardly, Krishna defends everything that's happened. But then he turns to Yudhishthira and he says, do you condone what Bhima has done by smashing, by stomping on Duryodhana's head? Privately to the Pandavas, he actually does not condone what has happened at the end to Duryodhana, what Bhima does just by stomping on his head. And Yudhishthira says, it wasn't, I didn't personally support that. But again, you have this pattern where Krishna advises something, it gets carried out, but in the process, it goes further than intended. And then at that moment, you have this one of my these key moments in the Mahabharata, this exchange between Duryodhana and Krishna, where Duryodhana once again, like Bhurishrava, criticizes Krishna, like Karna, he tries to appeal to Arjuna, knowing that Krishna may advise something. Duryodhana goes straight to Krishna. He says, he lists every strategy that Krishna has took. And he says, don't you think I wasn't aware of your role in taking Bhima out of battle? And he talks about Bhurishrava, he talks about Karna. He says, even Ghatotkacha, he knows that was engineered by him. And he calls him crooked and all of these things. He says, you've done this for them and you've helped them win, but look at the way you've led them to victory. I've died in battle like any good Kshatriya. And so, a Kshatriya who dies in battle can go to heaven. And at that moment, we're told that there's what's called a pushpa vrishti, a shower of flowers by the gods on Duryodhana. And the other side is sort of taken aback by that, of like, what, he's just said that, we've won through crooked means and now the gods are showering flowers. And then Krishna is now really, for this first time, he's really put in the position to defend his strategies and what he had to do. And he reminds, among other things, Duryodhana, like he does Karna, that no side here has followed the rules of war to a T. He reminds him about Abhimanyu's death. He reminds him about his own acts of adharma. And he says, a lot of this is on you. A lot of this is on you. And what he means by that is, there was a way to avoid this war and you chose this war. So with war comes death, and these people have been slain because of you. And so you have this exchange at the end of the Mace battle that kind of unsettles the Pandavas because of what Duryodhana brings to their attention and what he says to Krishna. And of course, Krishna defends it as this was necessary to lead the Pandavas to victory. And in a way, he's right, because he has led them to victory. And he did what, if we think back to the different approaches on Krishna to Dharma, Rama may not have even encouraged those tactics, but he may not have defended in the same way that Krishna defended it. Because Krishna, on a realistic level, says the path to victory wasn't there without these strategies.
Very, very interesting. It's been a fabulous talk. So I'll just want to sum up with one. Just to sum up, I'll ask one last question. So, if you were to look at the entire Mahabharata, and while you have spoken about almost all the exchanges that have sort of taken place between, say, Bhishma and Krishna, and Bhurishrava and Krishna, and later on Karna and Duryodhana talking to Krishna. There's a brilliant episode in the Stree Parva, which is post the of Gandhari having I think it's the Stree Parva. Whenever I read the Stree Parva is when you realize the futility of the war, because they literally go to the dead bodies of every slain warrior, and the women sort of lament about the fact that these were such great warriors when they lived, but now look at them, their eyes are being eaten by the vultures, and hyenas are tearing their limbs apart, and these are just dead bodies. And they were great warriors when they lived, and they did some great task, and this is what war reduces everyone to.
Yeah.
And within that, he sort of blames Krishna for this entire, sort of the massacre that happens on both the sides. Because ultimately, even from the Pandav side, after the Ashwatthama massacre, not too many people sort of live. Drishtadyumna is killed, and so is Shikhandi, and so is everyone else who's any kind of a decently good warrior. He's killed in the Pandav camp. They lose almost all of their sons. Just one remaining grandson that remains. That too in the womb. But Gandhari sort of accuses him of, sort of engineering this entire massacre. What are your thoughts on that? And yeah, with that, I think the last thing that I would want to know, other than this dialogue between the two of them, is what do you think Krishna's greatest quality or his greatest weapon was? Was it the fact that he was a divine incarnation, he was an avatar? Or do you think he was a great strategic mind who grew up the ranks to become a leader of the Yadavs and then finally sort of finish almost all Kshatriyas through the Mahabharata war? Or do you think it was the morals that he sort of, or the redefined morals that he carried? So the dialogue between Gandhari and Krishna, and what do you think Krishna's greatest quality or the greatest weapon was?
Yeah. Something that we've been circling back to in this conversation is how the Mahabharata treats war and violence. And we've seen that it doesn't glorify violence. They make arguments for why it may be necessary, but it also takes us through, like you say, in almost painstaking detail to show us the human cost of war. And to, in many ways, have us be sobered by it, that it doesn't just end with a war and everybody lives happily ever after. There's a series of episodes after the war where they zero in on the human cost of the war, and this Three Parva is one of those. Episodes, one of those where we're made to reflect on what violence brings, and hopefully make sober decisions about the necessity of violence based on that. And of course, so in the process of seeing all these slain warriors, Gandhari, the mother of the Kauravas, is there, and she's now happened to come, see her sons in different states of decaying, their bodies, and come to terms with that, their deaths. And she does fix her anger at Krishna at one point. And she says to him, and she's actually not the only person who says this. There's some other times where it's been said in the Mahabharata. She says, you were capable of taking this in another direction. But the word she uses is upekshita, that you have overlooked, been indifferent to this suffering that we're seeing here. So on the one hand, she is in some ways holding him responsible for this level of violence, but on the other hand, saying that you could have prevented that violence by preventing the war. And this use of upeksha as indifference, really, she's really calling into this thing. She's leaning into this idea that Krishna himself wasn't a combatant, but he stood by as this happened. And yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, and of course, Krishna, and then she goes further and she says that, look at how this family, this cousins, they killed each other. And in the same way, your family will kill each other in this kind of a way. And you will die, an ignoble death. And his reaction is, he smiles and he says, what is to happen will happen. But of course, he calls back to this, we were talking about the inevitability of the war on the cosmic level and the human level. On that human dramatic level, he did do he was a messenger at the court, trying to talk sense into Duryodhana. But it obviously didn't work. So in some ways, the Mahabharata is not just satisfied with saying there was a war, it ended, and we all live happily ever after. They spend so much of the text actually looking at the consequences of the war and holding different people to account. And of course, the words of Gandhari echo into, they foreshadow Krishna's eventual end in the Mausala Parvan, when he's killed by a hunter. And it's saying at that moment that he remembers the words of Gandhari, because what triggers the Yadavas killing each other in that later on, in that kind of fight where they get into a fight with each other, is actually the echoes of the war. Kritavarma and Satyaki start the, two people who have fought on different sides are still debating.
From the two different,
Yeah.
as to what, who really lived up to the dharma, and that sort of causes a argument, and then obviously all the divine interventions of the Musala reeds, and
Yes.
them getting weapons to sort of kill each other.
Yeah,
lovely. This was so the last thing, and so what do you think in all of this? Why do you think Krishna is revered so much? What was his? I mean, do we sort of pray to him because he was an avatar of Vishnu and hence he should be prayed to, or do you think it is because of his youth and the leelas that he ended up doing, or do you think we think of him as we pray to him because of his role in the Mahabharata?
I think he's revered today really for the first two that you mentioned, the first two options that you're given, and understandably so. But his role in the Mahabharata as primarily a strategist is actually one of the most fascinating, because he doesn't use his Sudarshana Chakra and end the battle in 1 minute or something. He doesn't, he actually leads them to victory. He has to convince the Pandavas, and like I said, there were times when Arjuna said no. So like he has to do what he does to lead these people to make difficult decisions that may not be popular in the moment, and also see the consequences of that. And that's what I think is one of the most fascinating aspects of Krishna's role in the Mahabharata. In a way, it can be seen as a Leela of Krishna, a different kind of a Leela, but it's this encouraging them to make difficult decisions, think about the consequences of those decisions, and really having them question, what do we mean when we say dharma? Who has followed it correctly and incorrectly? And what the right thing to do is in any given situation, to really think about what that is. And that's an important message of the Mahabharata.
Thank you. It was fabulous talking to you on not just Krishna's role in Mahabharata, but also so many other things that we could touch upon. And also, I think the key message that I think I take from this podcast is about, like you said, the futility of the war and the human cost of the war. That sort of happens, even if it means to restore the dharma and to but a war, maybe even that should be done without really getting into a war kind of a situation, because at the end of the day, people will stick to what they're, and we see that in the world right now. Everybody's sticking to their point of view, everybody thinking they are right, and historical, at one point in time, I remember I had written, when there is a war, it completely depends upon what time in the history do you take as the starting point. Do you take the like, for example, in case of Mahabharata, do you see the that Dhritarashtra not being put on the throne, and Pandu being put on the throne as the key point, because of which Dhritarashtra always had this desire to sort of stick to the throne, and even when his son was sort of doing it, he was okay with that, because he knew that if it goes away once, it's never going to come back that easily. So do you see that? Do you see the disrobing of Draupadi as the pivotal point? Do you see the early instances where Duryodhana and all were not really happy with the Pandavas and gave them a tough time in their childhood? So at what point in time in history do you think all of this starts? But absolutely, the more important point is to see, at what point in time you can end it all, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
This brings us to the end of the episode. It's been amazing to unwrap the genius of Krishna with Dr. Vishal over this 2-part conversation. It was lovely having you, Vishal. Hope we get to see you again and talk to you a little bit.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to having that discussion.
Guys, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit the like button, tell us about your favorite part in the comments, and subscribe to the Mythic channel. Stay tuned. More amazing episodes are coming your way.